Hey guys, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Phenomenology of Perception video 6 is where we're up to. So this one we're starting in part 1, which is about the body, and I'm going to divide this into, I'm going to sneak in the introduction to this part as well. So in this video we'll have the introduction to part 1 and the first chapter, I guess you could call it, the body as object and mechanistic physiology. So let's get into it with the introduction. So starting here, Merleau-Ponty wants to raise this issue of perspective. And he says that every perception is from a certain perspective, obviously. So the example he gives is that of a house. So if we look at the house, we see, however, whatever angle we view it from, we're viewing it from a particular angle. So there's always a perspective involved. Even though I look at the house from the front, obviously I know there are other perspectives I could take. I could walk around the house and see it from the back. I could take a bird's eye view, all of those different types of perspectives. So for Leibniz said that the house itself, what the house kind of really is a geometrical plan. So this would be something which is non-perspectival, but from which all perspectives can be deduced. So in a sense, it includes all perspectives, this geometrical plan. Looking at this, you could infer a perspective from any. You could infer what the house looks like from any perspective. So in that sense, it's the house seen from nowhere, Merleau-Ponty says. However, he asks, is this possible? Does this even make sense? Can we talk about something seen from nowhere? And so he looks at the expression or the proposition, I see the house. What does this mean? What do we mean when we say, I see the house? Well, first of all, we're obviously not talking about our eyes as material organs and the light reflecting off the boards or the windows, entering my eyes, striking my retina, leaving an image, blah, blah, blah. That's the scientific account, a scientific description of vision, but that's not what we mean when we say, I see the house. We don't mean, all of those physical, scientific, objective description accounts aren't included in what I'm saying when I just say I see the house. Rather, we're talking about the way we reach or apprehend the house. We're saying that I have this understanding, I have this picture of the house. I've grasped it, I've apprehended it in some way. And he calls this the gaze. Just to separate it from a kind of a scientific description, which is again very predominant these days. So it wouldn't be a surprise if you're talking to someone and asking them, what does it mean when you say you see something, and they break it down and give you a scientific description, but that's missing the sensation, it's missing perception itself. That hasn't grasped what we mean when we say we see something. So the gaze is Merleau-Ponty's word to capture this, as far as it concerns vision, at least. So perception in the gaze, as we're looking at it here, is a two-sided act. And he calls this the object horizon structure. So basically there are two horizons. There's the inner horizon of the object itself, and this is the figure. So if we're thinking in Gestalt terms, this is figure. And the outer horizon, which is the surrounding objects, or in this case, or in again, Gestalt thinking, the background, but also the unseen sides of the central object that we're talking about. So that the rear view of the house, or the view from the top, from a bird's eye view. So there's these two horizons, inner horizon and the outer horizon, and they that's the structure, that perception that builds perception. And he also notes that perception also involves, or with these inner and outer horizons, we can see that perception involves a concealing and an unveiling. So in order for the figure to become a figure, other objects have to recede into the background. They have to disappear, in a sense. They no longer take up my they're no longer a part of my gaze, despite the fact that light from all of those objects is still entering my eyes and impacting my retina, and all of that is still happening, but they no longer feature for me as part of my gaze. I'm not perceiving them anymore, or I'm perceiving them as background. So this concealing and unveiling, that's an important point. I think I stressed that in the last video too. And again, there's Heidegger talks about this very thing with his concept of the nothing, which he talks about in What is Metaphysics. And again, it was the same thing. The nothing is everything's the kind of background recede into this nothingness in order for something, a particular being, to stand out and appear before us. So again, there's that interplay between concealing and unveiling, and that's that thread carries through the whole of this book. And I've got a quote which captures this idea too. Thus, I can see one object insofar as objects form a system or a world, and insofar as each of them arranges the others around itself like spectators of its hidden aspects, and as the guarantee of their permanence. So that just captures that idea. There's one object, and it only appears in as much as the other objects recede and become a background or a world in which this one object can stand out. I like that, the way he says, as spectators of its hidden aspects. So they're looking at its hidden aspects, or aspects of it which are hidden for me, but they are kind of they're seeing those aspects for me on my behalf, guaranteeing that they're there, even though I'm not directly perceiving them. So anyway, he wants to, so this entails a modification of Leibniz's view. The house is not the house seen from nowhere, but seen from everywhere. So the house itself is all of those perspectives combined. That's what the idea, the central idea there is. So this is spatial perspective. It's perspective in a spatial sense that we've talked about now, but it's also true for the temporal perspective. So we can have this idea, the same idea carried into temporalities, where the present is the figure, if you like, and past and future are the background, and or the horizons, and these can be seen with the Husserlian terms, which Merleau-Ponty uses, protension and retention. But we'll look at those in more detail later. But it's just good to note that that's, I think Merleau-Ponty goes into a bit of detail in the book here, but I'll reserve more detail for this later, I think. So one thing that I did want to stress, which is important though, is that although the gaze through this horizontal structure intends other sides, intends the hidden aspects, the hidden perspectives, or the other Abschattung, I think is the Husserlian term. It never posits more than one side. So when our perspective, whenever we're looking at something, whenever we grasp something through the gaze, we never, even though we intend other objects, we're aware of them, we assume that they're there, we never actually have them in our grasp all at once. We only have the one perspective that we're viewing the object from. And that means that the object always remains open. We never have it in its fullness. We never see it completely, if you like. But this doesn't mean that there's something hidden, something mysterious, something, a core to the object that we can never reach. That's not the point. That's not the point here. There's nothing hidden in the object, no mysterious internal essence that we're forever locked out of. And I think you can read that as a bit of a reaction against Kant and his thing in itself. This is not what Merleau-Ponty is getting at. There is no sense in which the thing is fundamentally unknowable. So even though we never have access to all of those perspectives at once, and we'll never have access to all of them anyway. I mean, there'll be an infinite number of them. And so to some extent, the object is always open. We never have it in its fullness. We never grasp it completely. Yet there's nothing fundamentally hidden. That's the point. I had a big conversation about this actually with on the forum with Alex. If you're watching, I doubt he's watching, but about Sartre and the way he talks about this with the in itself, and the way that there isn't something hidden, although we never grasp everything. I mean, the thing is always completely open to us, and it presents itself in every one of its aspects. It completely presents itself to us, but we never grasp all of them at once. And yet there's nothing mysterious, there's nothing hidden fundamentally about the object. Okay, enough. Merleau-Ponty also says, though, that we tend to forget that our experience is perspectival in this way, and we tend to posit a single object. And in this sense, he says, in doing this, I take flight from experience and I pass over to the idea. So this is kind of like turning our lived experience into an abstract intellectualization. We're no longer focusing on what we actually perceive, which is this thing on a background from a perspective, from a single perspective. Rather, we think that's the thing, and we have it kind of in its entirety. And in a sense, we can do that mentally, but again, phenomenologically, this is not what's happening. And we tend to forget that and think, yes, I've grasped that object. This is what it is. It's one thing. It's this idea. And that is what leads to abstract, over kind of analytical thinking about human perception and human experience. And that's why it's something that isn't investigated, because it's obvious. We already know it. I know what the thing is. I perceive it. I see it. I've got it. But that doesn't do justice to the depths of perception and all of these things we're talking about now, experience. So this approach, positing this single object and forgetting that we have this perspectival experience, yields objective thought, which is the same for everyone, valid for all times and places, very scientific, very objective, right? And that includes everything, including body, time, space, world, these bigger ideas. They all become reduced to ideas, to abstract ideas that we and we then take those abstract ideas and think about them instead of thinking about the real thing, the thing that we experience. And that's why this phenomenal field that we talked about in the last video has been passed over, Merleau-Ponty says. Okay, so the situation that we're in at the moment is we either understand nothing of the subject because we absolutely posit the object as this abstract idea, or we understand nothing of the object because we are locked in this perspectival experience from I see the object from here, but there are an infinite number of different perspectives unavailable to me, so I understand only a fraction of the object. In order to overcome this, we need to understand the phenomenon. And that's how we come to a deeper understanding which threads this kind of needle here. And we'll begin with the body. And that leads us into this first section, the body, the first chapter, the body as object and mechanistic physiology. Okay, so the body. A couple of preliminary things to note. The body is not a mechanical device passively receiving stimuli. Talked about that quite a lot. The function of the organism is to understand the stimulation, understand the stimulus. So it's not just, again, causal, mechanical. We're talking about something more meaningful, more something that better reflects what we're actually doing, what human experience is. It's about understanding, not just receiving sensory inputs, like a video camera or some other kind of scientific measuring instrument. And this will involve, we'll see, a kind of blurring between the stimulus and the organism. And that's really what is at the core of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, certainly concerning the body, that it's not just the external world's out here, the subject is here, and information is transferred. There's a blurring, there's an ambiguity involved in this interchange, in this interplay between the subject and the object. And he briefly talks about this by saying that the body is a lived body. It's a living body. And we can see this, or the example he gives is in the hand. And if you're touching something with your hand sketches out the form you're about to perceive. So your hand in this way, and he says, in quite a nice expression, the body that we're talking about is a body that rises up toward the world. It doesn't just passively receive stimuli. It's out there, it moves out there and interacts, rises up towards the world. And that's what sensation is, that's what perception is, that gives us our experience. But if you pass over that, if you treat the body as just this thing, this machine that we move, you miss that, and you miss something fundamental about human perception and experience. Okay, so he looks at this, and we'll be discussing this throughout this whole chapter, is the phenomenon of the phantom limb. And so, I assume you've heard of it before. People who have their limb amputated, they often have residual feelings still associated. They still have they still perceive their arm, and sometimes this is associated with pain. So it can be really it can be quite bad, because if there's pain or there's an itch in the arm, which can happen after it's been amputated, they still have this feeling of an itch or pain. It can't be alleviated. Sometimes I remember reading the perceived arm, the phantom limb, is felt kind of twisted in an uncomfortable position. But because there's no limb, the subject can't alleviate that problem, alleviate the pain or the discomfort associated with it. There's nothing to physically move. So that's what we're talking about, this idea of this phantom limb, and how can we understand it? And Merleau-Ponty is going to break this down in some detail. So there are two aspects to it, really. It's psychological, obviously, because we're feeling something that's not actually there. And another way that this is a psychological phenomenon is that the limb shrinks in tandem with the resignation of the patient. So once the amputee feels, resigns themselves to the situation, understands or accepts the reality, the limb can actually, the limb will shrink or fade over time. And so there's something psychological going on here. But there's also something clearly physiological, because if you sever the nerves leading from the stump to the brain, the sensation of the phantom limb disappears as well. So that there's this dual aspect that we have to explain. And so we need an explanation involving both of these, psychological and the physiological. So before in order to get there, let's start with just an understanding of the situation. Before stimuli or sensible contents can affect us, we have to be anchored to the situation, and in such a way that the situation is lived as open for us. And this is basically what I was talking about in the introduction, the real introduction, not the introduction to this part, but with the phenomenal field, the idea of the phenomenal field, this way that we are, the world is open in such a way that things can appear for us. So before we can even be aware of something, before a figure can appear as a figure, the world has to present itself to us in some way. So we've got that. We must be, and the way that Merleau-Ponty puts this is we're anchored to the situation. We have to be anchored to the situation in such a way that we can receive stimuli. If we didn't have this connection, how could we receive stimuli in the first place, right? And ultimately, I think that's the downfall of Cartesian dualism. There's no way to bridge that gap. You've got mental stuff, external world, physical stuff, and there's just no way that there can be any correspondence between the two. So we have to be anchored to the situation somehow. And he discusses reflexes here, which are not conscious, right? They're not deliberate acts. If you have an automatic reflex, I don't know, the doctor banging your knee, it's such a common thing I think about with reflex, but no, that's never happened to me. I've never had that done. But still, that's the reflex. They tap you on the knee, and there's an automatic reflex, your leg kicking out. So it's not conscious. I'm not deliberately doing that, but it's not blind either. This is not something happening. Reflexes aren't something happening completely irrelevant, that completely not related to the situation. Rather, they adjust to the situation. Reflexes adjust to the situation. They invest it with a sense. Actually, the doctor tapping your knees, and probably not a good example there, but it's something you do automatically, something you do without thinking. But it's in response to a situation. I don't know, maybe you knock something off the table and you reach down and grab it quickly. You don't think about it. You don't deliberately intend it. It just happens. So it's in that sense, it's not conscious, but it's not just random either. It's not blind. it's already attuned to the situation in some way that's beneath consciousness, beneath your will, if you like. So it adjusts to the situation. And reflex, like perception, perception is an intention of our being. It's, remember we talked about it being non-thetic. It invests the situation with meaning before we analyze it, before we get there with our reasoning minds. So reflex, like perception, doesn't posit an object. That's not what happens with reflex. With a reflex action, you don't posit, deliberately intend something and will it. Rather, they are modalities of a pre-objective perspective called being in the world. Obviously, Heidegger there, being in the world. So that's nice. That's a good way to think about this, I think. These reflex and perception are both modalities of this pre-objective perspective called being in the world. And again, this lines up with what we talked about, that phenomenal field. It's this pre-objective sense we have before we analyze, before we posit objects, before we're thetically aware of things. And he gives another example to emphasize this point, or to make this point. When people lose their vision, when people go blind, sometimes there's a denial of this blindness, a denial that vision is fading, and that's a disorder might be a bit strong, but that's a phenomena called anosognosia. And the important thing here for us is that they haven't lost their sighted world, despite having lost sensory contact with it, visual contact. Vision is gone, but they insist that they can still see things. And even when they're walking around a room banging into things, they still insist that they have vision. They still have a sighted world. That there's still, the world is still available to them through vision. And on the opposite side, we also have people who give up before their vision is even gone, and so they have lost their sighted world, even though they're still in visual contact with the world, with the actual world. And so what we're talking about here, when I'm using the word world, basically this is an expansion of our understanding of what that word means. We're not talking about the physical out there. We're not talking about the external world. We're talking about our being in the world. And this is not then the same as the way that a scientist would talk about world. It's our connection to. It's this pre-objective connection we have with the world before we analyze it, before we think about it, before it's thetically present for us. And so treating the world in this, understanding the world in this way, means that our being in the world can't be just a sum of reflexes like empiricism. It can't just be sensory input, but it also can't be deliberate, directed acts of consciousness, which is the idealist position. So again, and we're going to be seeing this throughout just about every video, the empiricist understanding and the idealist understanding, and Merleau-Ponty wants to go down the middle or find a third option. And so yeah, when we think about the world in this way as this pre-objective perspective, then it allows us to see that empiricism won't get there, it just can't explain that. It can't account for it, but neither can idealism, as a where everything is a willed act of consciousness. Consciousness is supreme. And so that's the position we're at the moment with this pre-objective perspective. So bringing it back to the phantom limb, Merleau-Ponty says to have a phantom limb is to remain open to all of the actions of which the arm alone is capable, and to stay within the practical field that one had prior to the mutilation. So with this, even though you have a phantom limb, your limb is gone, you no longer have, say, an arm, but the world that you the world with your arm is still in operation for you, still functioning. You still have this, the way that you interact with the world is still includes your arm. You still understand the world. You still have this pre-objective perspective that includes your now missing appendage. And that's this pre-objective perspective. And interestingly, he says the world, this is just kind of an interesting aside, the world both hides and reveals this disability. So it hides the disability in the sense that the body is an unperceived center. The body, as the way you interact and the way you engage in the world, is not something before you. It's something you move through. You kind of transcend it. You go beyond it. What does Sartre says? You surpass your body, and that's a nice way to put it. You don't see your body because you're seeing with your body. And so the world hides the disability, but it also reveals the disability because you're conscious of the world through your body. So you've got an appendage missing that can't help but appear in the way that you interact in the world. So in this way, it both hides and reveals the disability. And Merleau-Ponty has this to say: the patient knows his disability precisely insofar as he is ignorant of it, and he ignores it precisely insofar as he knows it. This is the paradox of all being in the world. And that's, again, there's this idea of ambiguity, and that's going to be another recurring theme. So we've got this phantom limb, and the idea is that the world is still open to us, as it was when we had our limb. And even though we've lost it now, it's still open to us in that way. So there's kind of this disconnect a little bit. It's a bit of cognitive dissonance, if you like. And the way Merleau-Ponty talks about this, he says it's like the body with the phantom limb has two layers: the habitual body and the actual body. So the habitual body, in the habitual body, when we have this approach, gestures of manipulation still appear. We can still do things with it because our arm's still there. We're still interacting. We still have this pre-objective perspective, which includes our arm. But the actual body, those gestures have disappeared. They're no longer possible. But how is it possible to perceive objects as manipulable when I can no longer manipulate them? That's the problem we're wrestling with now. And it's basically the same problem that we had before when we looked at the phantom limb. How is it possible that I experience this limb that doesn't exist? Similar problem. And Merleau-Ponty says the manipulable must have ceased being something that I currently manipulate in order to become something one can manipulate. It must have ceased being something manipulable for me and have become something manipulable in itself. And so that's how we reconcile. That's how we keep this world alive in our habitual body, even though it's no longer viable. If we think about the actual body, the world becomes grasped under an aspect of generality. For one, it's the objects become things that objects are things that one can manipulate, people can manipulate. Even though, and that's how I can understand things are still manipulable, even though I can't do it. That's the actual and the habitual kind of merging, blending, if you like. In order for this to make sense for us, in order for this to occur, the world is grasped under this aspect of generality. It becomes somewhat impersonal from us, somewhat impersonal, becomes a little bit distanced. We think about the world, like I say, the objects are manipulable for people, not necessarily, not explicitly for me. But so what does this mean? The world is grasped under an aspect of generality. How can we understand this? Merleau-Ponty, in order to understand this, turns to repression. And the examples he gives are a love affair and a career. But when I think of repression, I think of more of like a traumatic experience that you it's not conscious. You don't consciously try and push it away, force it from your awareness, but it is repressed. You block it out, and that's what repression is. An event is pushed aside, but it's not relegated to the past. So that's the important point with regression, with repression. The event is pushed aside. It's no longer consciously present, but it's not relegated to the past like other normal events. It doesn't get left behind. We carry it with us. It's carried into the present, just not consciously. And so this is also kind of a problem to understand. How do we make sense of this? What does that mean? An event is pushed aside, but not relegated to the past. We carry it with us. It means that it remains before us, not in thought, but in our being. So in the way that we act, in the way that we interact with the world, it's still there. It's still present in our being, in the way that we engage in the world, even though it's not there as a conscious, thetic object for us. It's not posited as an object for us. And Merleau-Ponty says it hides behind our gaze as a style of being. That's a nice way to put it. It's there, hiding behind your perception, and it affects your perception. As a style. It's the way that you perceive now becomes a way that you perceive. You haven't left it behind in the past. It's with you now, but instead of being with you, like a memory, something that you're aware of, it don't want to use the word, it sounds so negative, but it kind of infects the way that you see everything now. And that is a negative word, which it shouldn't have that connotation. Perhaps it does with repression, but in general, it's not something negative. And he says it becomes a general feature of our reality. So it's just there in the background. It's general. There's that term again, a general feature. And so what we've discovered here with repression is it's not impersonal, but it's almost an impersonal existence surrounding our personal existence. It's this background way of being on which our personal existence, our thetic existence plays out. This almost impersonal existence, it's a general world orienting us in the world and shaping its form before the particular details of our personal experiences can emerge. So in this way, it's a little bit like the figure in the background. This the event that we've repressed slots into the background, and as such it affects the way that the figure appears for us. It's a little bit like that. I wouldn't want to push that analogy too far, perhaps, but yeah, it's just, there's this general impersonal world surrounding our personal existence, and in which our personal existence appears, in which our personal existence plays out. And both of these worlds that we're talking about here, this impersonal and the personal, they're grounded in temporality. But again, Merleau-Ponty talks about it a little bit here, but I'm going to reserve comment on that till much later, actually. So this orienting pre-objective adhesion to the world is precisely my organism, my body. And so that's how the body plays this central role for Merleau-Ponty. It's that which maybe generates too strong, but it's that which creates this field, this impersonal existence, this background general field in which things appear for me. And there are two features I've written down. First, just as repression grounds us in the world and shapes the world, anonymously, impersonally, preserving the world in which the event happened, keeping that world alive, and then from that, the personal existence, the current events take place with that as kind of a background. Just as repression does that, grounds us in the world and shapes it, so does the body. The body grounds us in the world and shapes the world for us. We perceive things with this body, through this body. It's not just a passive instrument through which we can objectively perceive. It shapes our field in a crucial way, which allows things to appear for us. So it can't just be ignored. That's the important point. The second point is also, like repression, the body is connected to temporality as the past, which I carry forward anonymously. So there's this idea then, this idea that the past is being carried forward with us. We saw that with repression. The past event is not relegated to the past, it's being carried forward. The body is the same for us. The body isn't something that we can, it's not something that happens in the past and we can leave it and move on. It's something that we carry with us, something which is always present for us and which always shapes the world that we perceive, shapes our understanding of the world, shapes our personal existence. And it's impersonal in the sense that it's not something conscious, it's not deliberate. Repression is an impersonal force shaping my world because it's not something I'm deliberately willing. It's not something I'm deliberately aware of, as it has this role, this function of shaping my world. And the same is true with the body, which earlier we described it as an unperceived center. So it's not something that is personal to me in the sense that it's something I'm willing or I'm actively controlling. It's something that's shaping my world without my conscious, thetic direction. Okay, so those are two things to say about that. I've got a short quote to summarize this. Thus, to summarize, the ambiguity of being in the world is expressed by the ambiguity of our body, and this latter is understood through the ambiguity of time. That is a really nice sentence there, I think. The ambiguity of being in the world is expressed in the ambiguity of our body, and that's understood in the ambiguity of time. And that really shows, I think, through the progression that we're going to take through this book. We've got this world, and the way it's the way that we engage in it through the body fundamentally, and that this also then will move to a deeper level to understand this in time and temporality. Parallel there with Heidegger too, by the way, who also, with being in time, Heidegger anyway, who wanted or thought that he was going to cash everything out in terms of temporality, or ground everything in temporality. He drops that project later, but Merleau-Ponty's all on board with it here. So it'll be interesting to see how he does with that, considering that Heidegger broke off and just didn't carry that forward. And the other thing I like about this is ambiguity. That's an important feature of our existence. Ambiguity. Our being in the world isn't crystal clear. Nothing's clear cut. Everything is ambiguous for us. And the reason is because we're engaging with this ambiguous, not instrument, this ambiguous, through an ambiguous method, which is the body. And that is captured in temporality, which is also ambiguous. So it all flows down that way. Okay, so that's nice. Let's bring this back to the phantom limb. So the phantom limb is like a repressed experience. It's quasi-present. Merleau-Ponty describes it as. And this is not then the causality. Again, this is not the causality of associationism, but rather, he says, the memory reopens lost time and invites us to again take up the situation that it evokes. So it's a motive rather than a cause. Again, not a motive in the sense that we can choose to accept it or not, but a motive in the sense that it's not rigid physical cause effect. It's not deterministic in that way. And he throws in a link here to emotion, which Merleau-Ponty doesn't talk about much. And as far as I can tell, he doesn't go to any great pains to distinguish his interpretation of emotion from the way Sartre describes emotion. And that's to say, as a magical act, a way of dealing with a situation with which one is unable to cope and yet doesn't want to escape. And so it abolishes the objective world with a symbolic satisfaction. I don't want to go into much detail because it's not really central. Merleau-Ponty doesn't treat it as central here. But in that sense, it's the phantom limb is the same as emotion. It has the same kind of reality, if you like, as emotion. So phantom limbs are as real as emotions are. We can't just write them off as illusions or something that's not real, like a hallucination or something like that. They're just as real as emotions are. If you think emotions are real, the phantom limb phenomena is also real. So then, if this is the case, why does severing nerves get rid of the sensation? Doesn't that mean that it's just all physical? And Merleau-Ponty's response to this is that the nerves keep the arm within the circuit of existence. They keep it alive in such a way that the subject can then fill it in with these with the prior sensations associated with having the arm. And you could do the same thing with the emotions. You could think about emotions in the same way. if emotions are real, how can they be manipulated by physical means? And you could imagine doing this by perhaps dulling or inhibiting the amygdala in some way, which tends to be linked with emotions. If you did that, you would definitely reduce emotions, right? You'd lose the emotional affectivity in the subject. But does that mean that emotions are therefore hallucinations? Are they then not real? Is emotion just a physical thing? I don't think so. That doesn't follow. And in the same way here, even though severing the nerves gets rid of the phantom limb, that's not sufficient for us to conclude it's just a physical problem. Forget about it. There's nothing more to see. Okay, so that's the phantom limb, and there's a little bit at the end that I haven't quite finished yet. Merleau-Ponty talks about these two things called the welt and the welt. Those are German terms. So he says animals have, and welt, as far as I can tell, means milieu, according to Merleau-Ponty, and welt is world. So he says animals have an welt, a milieu only. We also have a welt, a world. And that is, the world is this general, anonymous existence, access, background that we talked about earlier, field perhaps, whereas the milieu is that personal existence, that the one where everything is you're thetically aware of things, you're consciously directing actions. The world is that general background on which the personal plays out. So, I just got that here. The milieus take place within this wider, more anonymous world. So welt is this is a quote, the common reason of all milieus. And he also calls it the theatre of all behaviours. And that, I think those two expressions capture that idea. Welt is like that background which it shapes and it influences what appears for you in your milieu, your personal existence. This is a little less central to the point, I think, to the idea, but to be conscious, how are we conscious of both? In order to be conscious of both the welt and the welt, we must exist at a distance from solicitations that come from around us. And the quote I've got is, each momentary situation must, for us, cease to be the totality of being, and each particular response must cease to occupy our entire practical field. And so that is Merleau-Ponty is just saying that in order for us to be able to see and come to some sort of understanding about this background welt that we in which perception takes place. And again, I think this is just a synonym for the phenomenal field, for that phenomenal field in which attunes everything for us. In order for us to become aware of that, we have to be distanced a little bit from it. We can't be completely immersed in the world. We can't be completely lost in all of the sensory goings on. And this distance is created by the habitual body. We talked about that earlier, which mediates access through physical processes. And he says, he uses the words here, stable organs and pre-established circuits. So, by renouncing a part of his spontaneity, man can acquire the mental and practical space that will free him, in principle, from his milieu and thereby allow him to see it. So the physical, automatic, if you like, the way that our much of what happens is beneath conscious awareness, is subliminal. It's that which allows us to see the way that our milieu appears for us. If that wasn't the case, if we were like animals, and depending on how far down the kind of cognitive spectrum you go, if you go down low enough, there'll be no awareness of their own personal milieu, they won't have self-awareness, and that's because their minds are completely occupied with what's happening. There's no extra room, there's no space for them to take that step back, that mental step back, and put things or have this broader perspective. And we do this with this habitual body, which runs kind of on automatic. It's kind of on autopilot, and this renouncing of a part of our spontaneity, we're no longer in control of it, but it's that which gives us that mental and practical space to let us step back from our milieu and to actually then see it for the first time. So I quite like that. That's quite nice. And it also ties in with what we've said before about in order for something to reveal, something else has to be concealed. You have that operating together. And so that's nice. So let's bring this back together, answering the question which started us here, how the physiological and the psychical are tied together. The answer has turned out to be the habitual body, the body which creates this phenomenal field, which creates this welt in which personal experiences, milieu, on which personal experiences, our milieu can appear. So we can't divide the physiological and the psychical into the for itself and the in itself, because both are oriented toward a world. In other words, we're not a psyche joined to an organism. And so this is a shot against Descartes, for whom that's exactly what we were. We were a mind connected to a body, and that let us pick up, perceive, sense the external world. But that's not what we've found here. That's not what we've uncovered with this deeper, more thoughtful, more insightful approach to sensation. And this is not, I should just point out, it's not I suspect it's not a criticism of Sartre, or it shouldn't be anyway, despite the fact that he's using the language, Sartre's language, for itself and in itself, because Sartre was clear that the body is for itself as well. The body is not just an in itself. So there was that, the body had a dual aspect for Sartre. He was clear about that. And that means that he's not susceptible, not vulnerable to this criticism, I think. And he tends to get he tends to get some unwarranted criticism as having kind of divided the world into two, for itself and in itself. And that's not entirely what he did. He was definitely an ontological dualist, for itself and the in itself, but he was a substance monist. The only thing that existed, the only substance, the only being was, that's not right, he uses that word, but the only substance was the in itself. For itself was, this is the whole core of Sartre's philosophy, the for itself was nothingness, which you can think of as, it's like a perspective. It's a whole in being in which negation appears. So it's not a thing, it's not some other substance. So he doesn't cleave the world into two any more than someone cleaves the world into two by saying that there's non-conscious stuff and consciousness, right? But that's just a statement of human reality. We are conscious, and there are other things out there that are not conscious. But that doesn't mean that we've got this Cartesian dualism going on, and that's not what Sartre had, and particularly as concerns the body. So he didn't say that he didn't relegate the body to the in itself. It maintained a for itself aspect. Too much defense of Sartre maybe, but he's definitely, he does come in for some criticism later on, justly so, I think. But I don't think we can hold that against him, because his way of understanding experience was, it did include this ambiguity between the body as both for itself and in itself. So just a little plug for Sartre there. And I'll finish with a quick quote from Merleau-Ponty. We are a back and forth of existence that sometimes allows itself to exist as a body and sometimes carries itself into personal acts. And so, and that also ties in nicely with Sartre in his, although he called it bad faith, when you kind of switch between those two. But we can do that, and it's a fundamental feature of human existence, this idea that we're not purely body, but we're not purely consciousness either. We can slide between the two, and this is that ambiguity that is so crucial in Merleau-Ponty. So let's get a summary. First, we looked at the perspective, and we talked about the gaze, which is the way that's what we mean when we say we see something. We apprehend it rather than a scientific description. We looked at this object horizon structure, in which perception always operates, which was a nice link back to what we've talked about with that concealing and an unveiling idea. We saw that the perspective was spatial, but it could also be temporal in the same way. Then we looked at the habitual body, the way that the body is a pre-objective perspective. And Merleau-Ponty talks about this in connection with being in the world. And this idea, the body, the habitual body, is an anonymous, general, impersonal connection to the world, grounding the world. And again, just to be clear, when I say impersonal, I mean not as in some transcendental, something that transcends me, but I mean non-thetic, something I'm not consciously aware of, I'm not consciously directing. That's what that means. And two quick conclusions, which are nice summary points. We are a back and forth of existence. We have this ambiguous connection which lets us slide between being completely a body and being this kind of not disembodied but certainly less concerned with the body consciousness, where we're personally acting. The impersonal and the personal, that's really the sliding that we're talking about, the back and forth. And this nice expression, which I liked, the ambiguity of being in the world is expressed in the ambiguity of the body, and that is grounded or understood through the ambiguity of time. Okay, so that is the first video of part 1. There'll be 5 more of these. Yeah, nothing more to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.